The clock on the dashboard showed 11:47 p.m. when Lisa finally walked out of the hospital. She pulled her jacket tight against the cold mountain air and took a deep breath. Another 12-hour shift was done. Her feet hurt, her back ached, but she felt good about the work she'd done that night. 3 patients had gone home healthy, and that made everything worth it. She had been working as a nurse for 8 years now, ever since she moved to Colorado from the flat plains of Kansas. The mountains had called to her back then, promising adventure and a fresh start after her divorce. Now, at 34, she couldn't imagine living anywhere else. Even on nights like this, when the wind cut through her scrubs and made her wish she'd brought a thicker coat. The parking lot was almost empty. Most of the day shift nurses had gone home hours ago, and the night shift was just getting started. Lisa's old Honda Civic sat under one of the few working streetlights covered in a thin layer of frost. She scraped the ice off her windshield with an old credit card, something she'd learned to do during her first winter here. Back in Kansas, the worst weather she'd dealt with was the occasional tornado warning. As she started the car, she noticed the weather app on her phone showing a yellow warning symbol. Light snow expected, it said. Nothing too serious. She'd driven in much worse conditions before. The 20-mile drive home to her little cabin usually took about 30 minutes on the winding mountain road. Tonight, she figured it might take a bit longer, but she wasn't worried. She turned on the radio and found her favorite late-night talk show. The host was interviewing someone about their new book, something about finding happiness in small moments. Lisa smiled as she pulled out of the hospital parking lot. She'd learned a lot about finding happiness in small moments over the years, like the way her cat Whiskers always waited for her by the door, or how her morning coffee tasted better when she drank it while watching the sunrise over the peaks. The first few miles went smoothly. The main road through town was clear, with just a few other cars heading home from late shifts or closing time at the bars. Lisa knew this route like the back of her hand. Left at the gas station, straight through the small downtown area, then up into the mountains where the road got twisty and narrow. But as she started climbing higher, she noticed the snow was getting heavier. What had started as a few scattered flakes was now coming down steadily, coating her windshield faster than her wipers could clear it. She turned up the heat and slowed down a bit. No need to rush. Better to get home safe than fast. The radio crackled and she heard something about changing weather conditions, but the signal was getting weak as she climbed higher into the mountains. This happened sometimes. The mountains played tricks with radio signals, and cell phone service could be spotty too. She'd learned to live with it, part of the price of living somewhere so beautiful and remote. By the time she reached the halfway point of her journey, the snow was coming down so hard she could barely see the road markings. Her headlights cut through the white curtain of falling snow, but everything beyond that was just darkness. She gripped the steering wheel tighter and leaned forward, trying to see better. This wasn't the light snow the weather app had promised. This was turning into something much more serious. She thought about pulling over and waiting it out, but there wasn't really anywhere safe to stop on this stretch of road. The shoulder was narrow, and she'd be sitting right in the path of any other cars trying to make it through the storm. Her phone sitting in the cup holder showed no signal bars. Not unusual for this part of the drive, but it made her feel more isolated than usual. She tried to remember if she'd told anyone at work which route she was taking home. Probably not. She always took the same way, but it's not like anyone was expecting her to check in. The road curved sharply to the left, and Lisa felt her tires slip slightly on what must have been a patch of ice hidden under the snow. Her heart jumped, but she managed to keep control of the car. She needed to be more careful. The temperature had dropped enough that the snow was probably turning to ice as soon as it hit the pavement. She thought about turning around and going back to town, maybe getting a room at the small motel near the hospital. But she was more than halfway home now, and the idea of navigating back down the mountain road in these conditions seemed just as dangerous as continuing forward. The snow kept falling, heavier and heavier. Her wipers were struggling now, leaving streaks of ice across her windshield. She reached over to turn up the defroster, taking her eyes off the road for just a second. That's when she felt it, the car sliding sideways. Not just a little slip this time, but a real loss of control. She'd hit a patch of black ice invisible under the fresh snow. The steering wheel spun in her hands as the car skidded toward the edge of the road. Time seemed to slow down. She could see the guardrail approaching, could feel the car sliding despite her efforts to steer into the skid, like her father had taught her years ago. The radio was still playing that talk show, the host's voice calm and cheerful, completely unaware of what was happening in her small car on a dark mountain road. The guardrail wasn't enough to stop her car's momentum. It scraped along the driver's side with a horrible metal-on-metal screech before giving way. Lisa felt the sickening sensation of the ground disappearing beneath her tires as the car went over the edge of the road and started tumbling down the steep, rocky slope. The car rolled twice before slamming into a large pine tree with a sound like thunder. The airbag exploded in her face, and then everything went quiet except for the hiss of steam from the damaged radiator and the steady patter of snow on the crumpled roof. Lisa sat there for a moment, stunned and trying to figure out what had happened. Her left leg was trapped under the twisted dashboard, and she could feel a sharp pain that told her something was definitely broken. The car was tilted at a strange angle, nose down in the ravine, probably 50 feet below the road. She tried her phone, but still no signal. The car's engine had died, and she could already feel the cold seeping in through the broken windows. Snow was starting to pile up on the dashboard where the windshield had cracked. Looking up at where she'd come from, she could barely make out the faint glow of the road through the falling snow and darkness. Even if someone drove by, they'd never see her car down here. The storm was covering her tracks, erasing any sign that she'd ever been on that road. For the first time since the accident, real fear started to set in. She was hurt, she was trapped, and nobody knew where she was. 40 miles away from where Lisa sat trapped in her car, Jake Rodriguez was having trouble sleeping. The wind outside his small cabin was howling like a wild animal, rattling the windows and making the old wooden walls creak and groan. He'd lived in these mountains for 3 years now, ever since he'd retired from the Marines, and he'd never heard a storm quite like this one. He got up from his bed and walked to the kitchen, his bare feet cold against the wooden floor. The digital clock on the microwave glowed 12:23 a.m. His wife Carmen was somehow still sleeping peacefully in their bedroom. She'd always been able to sleep through anything: thunderstorms, earthquakes, even the sound of helicopters when they'd lived near the base. It was a gift he'd never had, especially since coming back from his last deployment. Jake poured himself a glass of water and looked out the kitchen window. All he could see was white, snow swirling in every direction, thick as a blanket. The storm had come out of nowhere. Earlier that evening, they'd watched the weather forecast together over dinner, and the meteorologist had only mentioned light snow. This looked more like a blizzard. He walked over to his ham radio setup in the corner of the living room. It wasn't much to look at. Just an old desk with a couple of radios, some antenna equipment, and a logbook where he kept track of his contacts. But this hobby had become important to him after leaving the military. It kept him connected to the outside world, especially during the long winter months when he and Carmen might not see another person for days. Jake had joined the local search and rescue team about a year ago. It seemed like a natural fit. He had medical training from the Marines, he knew these mountains better than most people, and he understood how quickly things could go wrong in conditions like this. The team had helped him find a new sense of purpose after struggling with the transition to civilian life. He turned on his main radio and started scanning through the emergency frequencies. Most nights there wasn't much activity. Maybe a trucker checking in or one of the other ham radio operators sharing weather reports. But tonight felt different. The storm was too big, too sudden for everything to be calm. At first, he heard the usual chatter. A couple of truck drivers on the interstate comparing road conditions. Someone from the weather service updating snowfall totals. Then, buried under the static and interference from the storm, he caught something else. It was faint, broken up, but it sounded like someone trying to send a distress signal. Jake grabbed his notebook and pen, trying to write down what he could make out. The signal was weak and kept cutting in and out. He couldn't tell exactly what the person was saying, but the tone was urgent. Someone was in trouble. He tried to respond. keying his microphone and asking for the person to repeat their message. But there was no reply. Either they couldn't hear him or their radio had stopped working. He kept listening, hoping to catch the signal again, but there was only static. Jake looked at the clock. It was almost 1 a.m. now. He knew that the official search and rescue teams wouldn't be able to do anything in these conditions. The county had probably already called off any non-essential operations until the storm passed. That was standard procedure. You don't risk more lives trying to save someone when the weather makes it too dangerous to operate. But Jake couldn't stop thinking about that distress signal. Someone was out there in this storm, probably scared and running out of time. He'd learned in the Marines that sometimes you have to make hard choices, that sometimes doing the right thing means taking risks that other people wouldn't take. He went back to the bedroom and quietly got dressed. Warm clothes, layers, his heavy winter boots. Carmen stirred as he was putting on his jacket. "Where are you going?" she asked sleepily. "I picked up a distress signal on the radio," he whispered. "Someone's in trouble out there." Carmen sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. "Jake, you can't go out in this weather. It's too dangerous. Wait until morning, until the storm passes." He sat down on the edge of the bed and took her hand. They'd had this conversation before, about his need to help people, about the risks he was willing to take. She understood better than most people why it mattered to him. She'd been there during the dark months after he'd come home from Afghanistan, when the guilt about the friends he couldn't save had nearly destroyed him. "I know it's dangerous," he said. "But if someone's out there, they might not have until morning. I've got the snowmobile and I know these mountains. I'll be careful." Carmen squeezed his hand. She knew there was no point in arguing. This was who he was, who he'd always been. The kind of person who ran toward danger when other people ran, away from it. "Just promise me you'll be smart about it," she said. "Don't be a hero. If it's too dangerous, you come home." Jake kissed her forehead. "I promise." He went out to the garage and started preparing his snowmobile. It was a heavy-duty machine, modified for search and rescue work. He'd installed extra lights, a stronger engine, and a cargo compartment for emergency supplies. He loaded it with everything he might need: medical supplies, emergency blankets, food, water, rope, even a small tent in case he had to wait out the storm somewhere. The wind was so strong when he opened the garage door that it nearly knocked him over. Snow immediately started piling up inside the garage. This was definitely the worst storm he'd seen since moving to the mountains. He started the snowmobile and checked all his equipment one more time. GPS, radio, first aid kit, emergency flares. Everything was working. He pulled on his helmet and goggles, knowing that visibility was going to be almost zero once he got away from the cabin. As he rode out into the storm, Jake tried to remember everything he could about that distress signal. It had seemed to be coming from the east, maybe from the direction of the main highway that connected the valley to the outside world. That road was treacherous even in good weather, with steep drop-offs and sharp curves. In conditions like this, it would be like a death trap. The snow was so thick that his headlights barely penetrated more than a few feet ahead of him. He had to navigate mostly by memory and instinct, following landmarks he knew even when he couldn't see them clearly. A big boulder here, a stand of pine trees there, the gentle slope that led down toward the creek. Several times, he had to stop and clear snow from his goggles and check his GPS to make sure he was still heading in the right direction. The cold was brutal, seeping through his clothes despite all the layers. His fingers were starting to go numb inside his gloves, and he could feel ice forming in his beard where his breath had frozen. But Jake kept going. Somewhere out there in this white hell, someone was waiting for help, and he'd be damned if he was going to let them down. Back in the wrecked car, Lisa was fighting to stay awake. The cold was creeping into her bones, and she knew that falling asleep in these conditions could be deadly. She'd learned enough in her nursing training to understand hypothermia, and she could feel the early signs starting. Her fingers were going numb, and she was beginning to shiver uncontrollably. She tried to move her trapped leg again, but the pain shot through her like lightning. Definitely broken, probably in more than one place. The dashboard had crumpled down on it when the car hit the tree, and she couldn't pull it free no matter how hard she tried. Every movement sent waves of agony up her leg. Lisa looked around the car for anything that might help. Her purse had flown somewhere during the crash, probably into the back seat that was now filled with broken glass and snow. She managed to reach her small emergency kit from the glove compartment, something her father had insisted she keep in every car she'd ever owned. Inside was a small flashlight, some bandages, a few energy bars, and a space blanket. The space blanket was thin as paper, but it was designed to reflect body heat. She wrapped it around herself as best she could, though it kept tearing on the broken glass and twisted metal. The energy bars were frozen solid, but she managed to break off small pieces and let them melt in her mouth. She needed to keep her energy up if she was going to survive this. Outside, the snow kept falling, piling up against the windows and slowly burying the car. She could see her breath now, and the small space was getting colder by the minute. The car's heater had died with the engine, and heat was escaping through the broken windows faster than her body could produce it. She tried her phone again, holding it up toward where she thought the road might be, hoping for even one bar of signal. Nothing. The screen was starting to act strange in the cold, the display flickering and responding slowly to her touch. Even if she got a signal, she wasn't sure the phone would work much longer in these temperatures. To keep herself awake and alert, Lisa started talking to herself out loud. She told herself about her plans for the weekend, about the book she was reading, about the vacation she was planning to take in the spring. Anything to keep her mind active and fight off the drowsiness that she knew came with hypothermia. Meanwhile, Jake was having his own battle with the elements. The snowmobile had already broken down twice, and he was starting to question whether he'd made the right choice coming out in this storm. The first time, snow had clogged the air intake, causing the engine to sputter and die. He'd had to clear it out with his bare hands, his fingers going numb in the process. The second breakdown was worse. Something in the fuel line had frozen, and he'd had to partially disassemble the engine to fix it. Working with tools in sub-zero temperatures while wearing thick gloves was nearly impossible, but taking the gloves off meant risking frostbite. He'd had to make the repairs mostly by feel, his hands shaking from both cold and adrenaline. Each time the snowmobile broke down, Jake lost precious time and body heat. He was burning through his energy reserves, trying to stay warm and keep moving. The cold was so intense that his water bottles had started to freeze solid, and he had to keep his radio inside his jacket to prevent the batteries from dying. The terrain wasn't helping either. What should have been familiar trails were now unrecognizable under feet of snow. He'd already gotten stuck 3 times, having to dig the snowmobile out and find alternate routes. Once he'd nearly driven off a small cliff that was completely hidden by the snow, only stopping when his headlight caught a glimpse of empty space ahead. But Jake kept going. Every few minutes he would stop and try to pick up that distress signal again on his radio. Most of the time there was nothing but static, but occasionally he would catch a faint signal that seemed to be coming from somewhere ahead of him. It was like following a ghost, a whisper in the storm that kept pulling him forward. The worst moment came when he was crossing what he thought was a frozen creek. The ice looked solid under the snow, and he'd crossed this same spot dozens of times during winter training exercises with the search and rescue team, but this time the ice wasn't as thick as it appeared. The snowmobile broke through with a loud crack that echoed through the forest despite the howling wind. Cold water immediately started rushing into Jake's boots as the machine tilted forward into the creek. For a terrifying moment, he thought both he and the snowmobile were going to disappear under the ice. Jake threw himself backward off the seat, grabbing onto a tree branch that was hanging over the creek. The snowmobile's track was still spinning, trying to find traction on the muddy creek bottom. Slowly, carefully, he managed to work his way around to the back of the machine and push it toward shallower water where the ice was thicker. It took him nearly an hour to get the snowmobile out of the creek and running again. By the time he was back on solid ground, his boots were full of ice water, and he could no longer feel his feet. He knew he was dealing with the early stages of frostbite, but stopping to properly warm up wasn't an option. Someone was counting on him. Jake pulled out his emergency foot warmers and shoved them into his boots. hoping they would be enough to prevent serious damage. He changed into dry socks from his emergency kit, though his feet were so numb he could barely feel what he was doing. Back in the car, Lisa was fighting her own losing battle against the cold. The shivering had stopped, which she knew was a bad sign. Her body was shutting down non-essential functions to preserve heat for her vital organs. She was having trouble thinking clearly, and several times she caught herself starting to fall asleep. She tried exercises to keep her blood flowing, moving her arms, flexing her hands, even trying to tap out rhythms with her fingers. But her movements were getting slower and weaker. The broken leg made it impossible to generate much body heat through movement. Lisa started thinking about her life, about the people who mattered to her, her parents back in Kansas, who still worried, about her living alone in the mountains, her co-workers at the hospital who had become like family over the years, her cat Whiskers, who would be waiting by the door for her to come home. The thought of Whiskers waiting for her gave her a new surge of determination. Someone had to find her. She couldn't just give up and let the cold win. She started honking the car horn, even though she knew it was probably pointless. The sound was muffled by the snow and wouldn't carry far in the storm. But it was something to do, some way to fight back against the situation. Unknown to her, Jake was getting closer. The faint signal on his radio was getting slightly stronger, though it was still broken up by static and interference from the storm. He was following a hunch now, heading toward the main highway where he thought someone might have gone off the road. The snow was so deep that he could barely tell where the road was, but he kept pushing forward, knowing that time was running out for whoever was sending that distress signal. Jake had been searching for almost 3 hours when he finally reached the main highway. The road was completely buried under snow, but he could make out the general shape of it by following the line of guardrails and road signs. This was where he thought the distress signal was coming from, but in the whiteout conditions, finding one crashed car would be like looking for a needle in a haystack. He stopped the snowmobile and pulled out his radio again. The static was louder, here probably because he was higher up on the mountain where the wind was stronger. But underneath all that noise, he could still hear something. It was definitely a signal, and it was close. Close enough that whoever was sending it might actually be within a few hundred yards of where he was standing. Jake started riding slowly along what he thought was the edge of the road, scanning left and right with his spotlight. The beam could only penetrate about 20 feet through the falling snow, but it was better than nothing. He was looking for any sign of a vehicle, broken guardrail, tire tracks, anything that might indicate where someone had gone off the road. About half a mile down the highway, his light caught something that didn't look right. The guardrail was bent and twisted, and there was a gap where it looked like something heavy had crashed through. Jake stopped the snowmobile and got off to investigate. The metal was scraped and dented, with what looked like paint marks from a car. This had to be it. He peered over the edge of the road into the ravine below, but his light couldn't penetrate far enough through the snow to see the bottom. If there was a car down there, it was buried deep. Jake knew he had to get down into that ravine, but it was steep and covered with loose rocks hidden under the snow. One wrong step could send him tumbling down the slope with no way to stop. He tied a rope to his snowmobile and secured the other end around his waist. It wasn't perfect, but it would give him something to hold on to if he started to fall. The descent was terrifying. Every step sent loose rocks sliding down into the darkness below. The snow was so deep that sometimes he would step forward and sink up to his waist, having to struggle to pull himself out. The rope kept getting tangled in branches and rocks, forcing him to stop and untangle it with hands that were now completely numb from cold. About 30 feet down the slope, Jake's light finally caught a glimpse of something that definitely wasn't natural. It was the outline of a car, almost completely buried under snow. Only part of the roof and one side mirror were visible above the white blanket that covered everything else. He half ran, half slid the rest of the way down to the car, his heart pounding with excitement and fear. Was someone still alive in there? How long had they been trapped? The snow on top of the car was several feet deep, which meant it had been here for hours. Jake started digging frantically with his hands, trying to clear snow away from the windows so he could see inside. His gloves were torn and his fingers were bleeding from the cold and the sharp ice, but he didn't care. Someone's life depended on how fast he could work. Finally, he managed to clear enough snow from the driver's side window to shine his light. Inside, what he saw made his stomach drop. There was a woman slumped over the steering wheel, not moving. She was wrapped in what looked like an emergency blanket, but her lips looked blue even in the strange light from his flashlight. Jake banged on the window. "Hey, can you hear me?" he shouted over the wind. To his relief, the woman stirred slightly. She lifted her head and looked at him with confused, glassy eyes. She was alive, but barely. Jake could see that she was in the late stages of hypothermia. Her movements were slow and uncoordinated, and she seemed to be having trouble understanding what was happening. The car door was jammed shut, probably from the impact and the twisted metal. Jake tried pulling on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. He looked around for something to break the window with, finally settling on a large rock that he dug out from under the snow. "I'm going to break the window," he yelled to the woman inside. "Cover your face." The woman seemed to understand and pulled the space blanket over her head. Jake struck the side window as hard as he could. The first hit just starred the glass. The second hit sent spiderweb cracks across the entire surface. On the third hit, the window finally gave way, collapsing inward in a shower of small pieces. Cold air and snow immediately rushed into the car, but Jake could now reach the woman inside. She was shivering violently again, which was actually a good sign. It meant her body was still trying to warm itself. "My name's Jake," he said, trying to keep his voice calm and reassuring. "I'm here to help you. What's your name?" "Lisa," she managed to say through chattering teeth. "My leg. It's stuck." Jake shined his light down and saw that her left leg was trapped under the twisted dashboard. The break in her leg was obvious even through her pants. It was bent at an unnatural angle. Moving her was going to be extremely difficult and painful, but first he had to get her body temperature up. Jake pulled out his emergency supplies and started working. He had chemical heat packs that would activate when he bent them, and he placed these against Lisa's chest and back. He wrapped her in his own emergency blankets, adding layers of insulation around the thin space blanket she already had. "Lisa, I need you to stay awake," Jake said, gently shaking her shoulder. "Can you tell me what day it is?" She looked at him with confusion. I don't know. Tuesday. I was driving home from work." Her speech was slurred, and Jake could tell she was having trouble thinking clearly. The hypothermia was affecting her brain function. He needed to get her warm and get her out of here, but the storm was still raging outside. Jake tried his radio to call for backup, but got nothing but static. They were in a dead zone, probably blocked by the mountains and the storm. He was on his own. Working as carefully as he could, Jake started trying to free Lisa's trapped leg. The dashboard had crumpled down on it, and he had to use a small crowbar from his emergency kit to try to pry the metal apart. Every time he moved anything, Lisa cried out in pain, but she gritted her teeth and tried to stay quiet. It took almost an hour, but Jake finally managed to create enough space to slide Lisa's leg out from under the dashboard. She nearly passed out from the pain, but Jake kept talking to her, keeping her conscious and alert. "We're going to get you out of here," he promised. "But I need to splint this leg first, and then we're going to have to wait for the storm to calm down a bit." Using supplies from his first aid kit, Jake carefully splinted Lisa's broken leg. It wasn't perfect, but it would prevent further damage when they had to move her. He gave her some pain medication from his kit and shared his emergency food and water. Then they settled in to wait. Jake set up a small emergency shelter using his tarp, creating a windbreak that would protect them from the worst of the storm. He kept Lisa talking, asking her about her job, her family, anything to keep her mind active and alert. The storm showed no signs of letting up, but at least Lisa was stable now. Jake knew that the real test would come when they tried to get back up that steep slope to his snowmobile. Jake and Lisa huddled together in the makeshift shelter for what felt like forever. The storm continued to rage around them, but slowly, very slowly, it began to lose some of its fury. The wind wasn't howling quite as loud, and the snow wasn't falling quite as thick. Jake kept checking his watch. knowing that every hour that passed was another hour that Lisa's body was fighting to recover from the hypothermia. He had been monitoring her condition carefully, the way he'd learned to do during his military medical training. Her skin color was getting better, and she was speaking more clearly now that the heat packs and blankets had brought her body temperature up. But he knew she needed real medical attention, and soon. "How are you feeling?" Jake asked, adjusting the blankets around her shoulders. "Better," Lisa said, and her voice was stronger now. "Still cold, but not like before. My leg hurts like crazy, though." "That's normal," Jake assured her. "The splint is holding everything in place, but you're going to need surgery to fix that break properly. We need to get you to a hospital." Lisa looked up at the steep slope they would have to climb to reach the road. Even with 2 good legs, it would be a difficult climb in these conditions. With a broken leg, it seemed almost impossible. "I don't think I can make it up there," she said quietly. "You don't have to," Jake replied. "I'm going to carry you." It sounded crazy, even to him. Carrying someone up a steep, icy slope in the middle of a snowstorm was exactly the kind of thing that rescue manuals warned against. But they didn't have a choice. The storm was supposed to last until morning, and Lisa needed medical attention now. Jake spent the next hour preparing for the climb. He rigged up a carrying system using his rope and some of the emergency equipment, creating a makeshift harness that would distribute Lisa's weight across his shoulders and chest. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to work. The climb was the hardest thing Jake had ever done. Every step was a battle against the snow, the ice, and gravity. Lisa tried to help by holding onto his shoulders and moving her good leg when she could, but most of her weight was on Jake's back. His legs burned with the effort, and his lungs felt like they were on fire in the cold air. 3 times during the climb, Jake had to stop and rest, setting Lisa down on a small ledge or against a tree. Each time, he wondered if he had the strength to pick her up and continue. But each time he thought about his promise to Carmen, about his duty to never leave someone behind, and he found the energy to keep going. When they finally reached the top of the slope, both of them were exhausted. Jake's snowmobile was still there, covered in snow but running when he started it up. Getting Lisa onto the back of the snowmobile was another challenge, but they managed it with her sitting behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist for support. The ride back to Jake's cabin took twice as long as the trip out had taken. Jake had to drive slowly and carefully, constantly checking to make sure Lisa was still conscious and holding on. Several times he stopped to adjust her position or to add more heat packs to keep her warm. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was starting to come up, and the storm had finally begun to weaken. Carmen was waiting for them at the door, having stayed awake all night worrying. She took one look at Lisa and immediately went into action, helping to get her inside and onto the couch by the fireplace. Carmen had been a nurse herself before retiring, and she quickly assessed Lisa's condition while Jake called for an ambulance on their landline. The roads were still impassable for regular vehicles, but the emergency services had snowplows and specialized equipment that could make it through. "The ambulance will be here in about an hour," Jake told Lisa. "How are you doing?" "I'm alive," Lisa said with a weak smile. "Thanks to you. I thought I was going to die in that car." "You would have," Carmen said matter-of-factly as she checked Lisa's pulse. "Your body temperature was dangerously low when Jake brought you in. Another hour or 2 and it would have been too late." When the ambulance finally arrived, the paramedics were amazed by the story. They'd been on duty for years, but they'd never heard of someone attempting a rescue in conditions like that. They carefully loaded Lisa onto a stretcher and prepared to take her to the hospital. "Thank you," Lisa said to Jake as they wheeled her toward the ambulance. "You saved my life." "Just doing what anyone would do," Jake replied, but Lisa shook her head. "No," she said firmly. "Not anyone would do what you did. You risked your life for a complete stranger." At the hospital, doctors confirmed that Lisa had suffered severe hypothermia and a compound fracture of her left leg. She spent 2 weeks in recovery, undergoing surgery to repair the break and treatment to prevent complications from the frostbite on her fingers and toes. But she made a full recovery, with no permanent damage. The story of the rescue made headlines in the local newspaper and then got picked up by regional news stations. Jake was embarrassed by all the attention, insisting that he'd just done what felt right. But the community saw him as a hero, and the story inspired others to volunteer for search and rescue operations. 6 months later, Lisa knocked on Jake and Carmen's door. She was walking normally again, with just a slight limp that the doctors said would probably fade with time. She'd brought a gift, a photo of her cat, Whiskers, the one she'd been thinking about during those dark hours in the car. "I wanted to thank you again," she said. "And I wanted to ask you something." "What's that?" Jake asked. "I'd like to join the search and rescue team," Lisa said. "I want to help other people the way you helped me." Jake smiled. "I think that's a great idea. We can always use someone with medical training." Lisa did join the team, and over the next few years, she and Jake worked together on dozens of rescues. They became close friends, bonded by the experience they'd shared on that terrible night in the storm. Lisa often said that Jake had given her more than just her life back. He'd given her a new purpose. Jake never considered himself a hero. He'd tell anyone who asked that he'd just been in the right place at the right time with the right skills and equipment. But Lisa knew better. She knew that what had saved her wasn't just Jake's training or his snowmobile or his emergency supplies. What had saved her was his decision to go out into that storm when everyone else stayed home, his refusal to give up when things got difficult, and his willingness to risk everything for someone he'd never met. Sometimes Lisa would drive past the spot where her car had gone off the road. The guardrail had been repaired and there was no sign of what had happened there. But she would always remember that night, and the stranger who became a friend, who proved that there are still people in the world willing to put their lives on the line for others.